Okay. Well, I'm Joe Grano, the guy on the book. Thank God for airbrushing. Let me begin by telling you the genesis of the book, because I never intended to write a book. But approximately 6 years ago, my son was graduating from high school, and I have two daughters long out of the nest, and they didn't grow up with the affluence that he did, because I got more successful later in life. And what I wanted to do was give him a meaningful gift for a graduation present, and I didn't want it to be a material gift. So what I decided to do was to write him a diary, which I called A Letter to My Son. And each night after work, to 2 in the morning or so, I would write this journal, so he'd get a better insight as to who I am, what my thoughts were, what my values were, and I also tried to lessen his load going into life with leadership tenets and the like. And the deal I made with him is that he had to reread it every 5 years and not to show it to anybody. And when he came out of the room after he read it, he said, "Dad, you've got to share this with other young people." And that kind of stayed in my brain for quite a while. And then I started an intern program for young people, juniors in college. And that, coupled with the experience of him reading the book, I got convinced into writing the book. And the approach I took, believe it or not, is I started a year ago, August. I would work out of my home every Friday, and I get a long legal pad, and by hand I wrote this book. The publishers convinced me to take a chronological approach to the book, and that's what I did. I started out as a young man in what you call the hood in Hartford, Connecticut, Little Italy, and graduated from high school, went to college for 3 whole months, decided to leave and go fight the war in Vietnam, get it over with and come back to school. Well, entered the service as a private in the U.S. Army. Based on the IQ test, the Army waived the college degree requirement to go to officer candidate school. And here I am at 18 and a half years old going to OCS. And I spent 6 years in the service. I was a captain at 21, 22 years old. I had the privilege of serving in the U.S. Special Forces, which you know as the Green Berets. I spent 2 years in South America playing with Castro and the boys in about 9 different countries, and then off to Vietnam, and full-term Vietnam as a company commander. That was kind of the background for the book. That was my real first experience in a leadership position that really counted, and I can tell you from that experience in Vietnam, you really learn 2 things. One, there is nothing uglier than war, and it gives you a better sense of humanity in terms of appreciating life. I, for instance, can't hunt and haven't hunted since Vietnam, and particularly for sport. I would never do that any longer. So I took this chronological approach, and as a preface to the book, I started off in trying to answer the question I'm always asked at every university and college that I speak at. And the first question I get from some young person is, "Joe, are leaders born or are they made?" And after all of the years of experience and the gray hair, I answer that question by saying it's both. People that have the intrinsic skills, and particularly interpersonal skills, and have that common fiber, which is caring about people, can learn leadership skills and be a good leader. Great leaders, however, like a Jack Welch or Lee Iacocca or Dick Grasso, in my view, those people are born, not made. It's in their DNA the minute they walk in, and I believe that you can see that even in young children. People kind of break out and have that born attribute. They're very charismatic, they care about people, they're generally good speakers, they're good managers in at least our industry, they have vision, and on and on and on. But the key point is, good leaders can be made. And that's what I try to do in this book. I'm not a diarist. I've learned my leadership skills kind of ad hoc throughout my life. And in the book, what I do is I present a living example of what I went through in a leadership position. And given the tenure of the last 40 years, I happen to be in leadership positions in very big times of crisis in the history of our nation, starting with Vietnam, moving to one of the worst bear markets in the history of the stock market from 1972 to 1982, the Russian default on their sovereign debt, the Hunt silver crisis, which was quite painful for many firms on the street, not ours, thank God. And then, of course, the crash in '87. At that time, I was in a major leadership position at Merrill Lynch and taking over a firm that was terribly broken in Paine Webber. And then, of course, 9/11, which I had a very instrumental position in getting the exchange back up. And subsequent to that, I was asked by the president to chair the Homeland Security Advisory Council for him, which I did pro bono at the same time that I was CEO of Paine Webber. And now the current crisis, which is on everybody's mind. So the gray hair and the timing had me in a position where I had the experience of real time. So what I try to do in this book is match, call it concept theory, leadership skills, with actual experience, which makes it hopefully a little bit different. First chapter of the book really talks about problems require solutions, and I use as an analogy in that particular chapter my experience in Vietnam. I arrive in Vietnam as a Green Beret captain. I am assigned initially for the Ranger Battalion in the 4th Infantry Division, which was a tremendous compliment because that's generally a lieutenant colonel, and I'm a young captain. And then the phone rings. Next thing I know, I'm off to a place called Khe Sanh, where a infantry company made up of draftees had gotten really decimated. They lost 27 men, 27 fatalities. And I was asked to get them off that hill and get them back into combat. Well, they literally walked off the hill, but I had a group of 87 survivors who basically weren't very enamored with Vietnam, nor with me as their new company commander, and that was a heck of a challenge. That was one big problem. And what I did in Vietnam, the conventional way of dealing with soldiers who were there for a year, was to take them out of combat when they had 1 month left in tour of duty. And I basically asked them, how many of you have 2 months left? 11 soldiers raised their hand. I said, get out of the formation, you're not going back in combat. And it leads you to a concept that people, if you put yourself in a position where you understand their self-interest and a level playing field with yours, you can win over the hearts and minds. And that's what happened. That 87-person infantry company turned out to be the most successful company in Vietnam. They killed, captured, and wounded more Viet Cong and NVA than the combined total of the Americal Division, which was 10,000 men. And it came from great officers that I recruited, and it came from developing a culture and a camaraderie where my soldiers understood that we had common interest, and that was very important. I go from there to talking about being the optimist, to be the internal optimist in everything you do. And I could relate to that personally as well, because on my last mission in Vietnam, I was terribly wounded. I was almost a double amputee. And came into the hospital, took a year of convalescence, had to learn to walk again, and I learned about the power of the mind. And as long as you took an optimistic view and didn't wallow in self-pity and the like, anything is possible. And that was perhaps one of the most, I'd say, important framing of my character throughout life. It wasn't about physical stamina. It was really about a will and an optimism that I wasn't going to let this get me down. And albeit the doctors at the time said I'd be wearing braces and couldn't pick anything up heavier than a milk bottle with my left arm, none of that turned out to be true. And it really came from the optimism and the attitude going in. And I think that's very important for business leaders and any young person coming into business, because it's really half the battle, having that positive attitude day in and day out. Then I moved to a chapter talking about problems require solutions, talk a little bit about the experience in Vietnam again and how we turned it, and more importantly, when you take over an organization or an infantry company and that organization has serious problems, too often the chief executive will look more for the postmortems. Why did this happen? Who did it? And when you hear that kind of dialogue in a room, you're starting off with a negative. The CEO or a leader has to basically focus on solutions. And who did it is not the way to approach this, because sometimes the person who made the mistake is the only person who can fix the problem. And if you start out with who did it, you drive them into a foxhole or they hide, and you don't get a focus on improvement. So again, it's part attitudinal, but it's also a leadership tenet that people need to understand. The CEO's job is to, yes, show the issues and the problem. Your employees understand that they have a problem, but then you deal with the issue of truth and consequence. Here's the truth of the situation, here are the consequences if we don't fix it, and here's how we're going to fix it. But again, the problem requires a solution, not an analysis of postmortem. The only good thing about a postmortem, look at it in terms of precluding making the same mistake going forward. That's it.